Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. We'll get started in about a minute to let some more people join. There will be a Q&A at the end, and you can use the Q&A feature on your screen to type in your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for a full Q&A. And then I'll hand it over to our speakers to get us started.
Thank you, Kate, and welcome everybody to our MedISAO webinar today on medical device software security, leveraging SBOMs and cross-industry practices. We are honored to have with us today our guest speaker, Tom Ulrich. Tom, do you want to briefly introduce yourself? Tom, you're on mute.
Okay.
Okay.
I want to apologize. There's some construction going on in the building where I live today. So if it gets too noisy, put something in the chat or something, and I'll or in the Q&A, and I'll, mute myself. But yeah, I'm a cybersecurity consultant. Been one for a long time. I previously worked for Honeywell and Deloitte. I'm now independent. Since 2013, I've been writing a blog on cybersecurity issues that has a large following now. I've written about various things, but one I've written about a lot lately is software supply chain security, including software bills and materials. In fact, I don't even have it on here, but I wrote a book, which is on Amazon now, the Introduction to SBOM and VEX. And it's literally the only book that says anything about software bill of materials or SBOM. If you search for SBOM on Amazon, you will get my book and nothing else. So, right. Last time I looked, there was nothing. So, but anyway, it is a good book. So, yeah, recommend you check it out. And I founded last year, 2 years ago, the OWASP SBOM Forum, which is still going strong. And it's a group of industry practitioners, and everyone is welcome to join, who are developing solutions. What we're trying to do is figure out how to make SBOMs more widely used than they are now. And we're working on that in various ways.
Great.
So, okay.
Thank you, Tom. Yep, Thanks, Tom. And then I myself, I'm the Chief Security Strategist at MedCrypt. I also support MedISAO, and its initiatives have been in the healthcare industry my entire career, first job out of college, so to speak, and have been in cybersecurity with focus on the healthcare industry for the past 15 years. And then also we have with us my colleague Om. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Thanks, Axel. My name is Om Mahida. I lead product at MedCrypt. Been working on cybersecurity in healthcare for about almost 8 years now. Also straight out of college and just kind of dived right into the field. I have a technical background as a computer engineer and software engineer before, and really am looking forward to this conversation today with Tom and Axel.
Thanks, Om. Now, as far as the agenda is concerned, briefly going to talk about the state of cybersecurity in the healthcare industry, just to set the stage. And then Tom is going to take us through a couple of learnings from other industries outside of healthcare on how SBOM and vulnerability sharing is managed in those industries. And then Om is going to close us out with a couple of examples on the ins and outs of SBOM sharing and vulnerability disclosure, and some of the challenges we face as an industry specific to medical devices. So again, just to set the stage, here in the US, since 2009, we have mandatory reporting of data breaches that impact protected health information, PHI, and impact more than 500 individuals. Those breaches need to be reported to Health and Human Services, and they get published in a database that is commonly referred to as the Wall of Shame. So we have an opportunity to analyze now 13 years of data and understand the big picture trends in the healthcare industry. And there are a couple of learnings here from this slide, from this analysis. One being that regulatory incentive can work, right? If you look at the bottom category, the blue, the dark blue, that is theft of things like laptop, external hard drives, and so forth. And that used to be in the early years the leading cause of data breaches, and is now down to less than 1% of the breach record, 2% of total breaches. And the reason for that, in my interpretation, is the fact that there is an exemption in the breach notification law that says if the stolen device is encrypted, then you don't have to report it. So therefore, again, that motivated, I think, participants to invest in encrypted devices. And I don't think there are fewer devices being stolen nowadays, but most of them are now encrypted and therefore less reporting. At the same time, we see the yellow, which are hacking IT incidents, granted a fairly broad category, but that is now accounting for 80% of breaches, and even more concerning, accounting for 94% of breach records. And it has been the sole driver of growth since 2015. And that is driven by ransomware attacks, right? The cyber adversaries, financially motivated cyber criminals, have identified healthcare as an industry that is an easy target, that has a weaker security posture than, for example, the financial sector, but also has a higher pressure to restore operations, and therefore it is more likely that they can get paid. Right? And we've seen over the last couple of years the ransom demands grow from what used to be $10,000, $100,000 to now reach millions and multi-million dollars. For example, the Change Healthcare breach, United Health paid $22 million to the attackers to get their data back. So clearly worrisome trends. We are not progressing as fast as we should. And we have now seen almost 6,000 breaches reported across the healthcare industry, and more than almost 500 million patient records being breached. So those are some staggering numbers. But what does that mean, right? If you sometimes read the headlines in the security press, especially non-healthcare people writing about healthcare, you often get those, oh my God, somebody can hack into grandpa's pacemaker kind of headlines. Of course, a pacemaker is a concern, but the reality is quite different. And the reality is that ransomware attacks and other cyber events do have a measurable impact on patient outcomes. The left study demonstrated a 20 to 35% estimated increase in mortality rate during a ransomware attack, and fairly recent study from late last year. And then the study on the right from UCSD showed that not only the targeted affected hospitals sees an increase in mortality rate, but also adjacent hospitals, because they have to pick up the slack, so to speak, and see the emergency room volumes increase, and therefore patients see increased wait times, increased time to diagnosis and treatment. More patients leave without being seen because they get frustrated, and so forth. So cyber attacks in the healthcare industry have a demonstrable and measurable impact on patient outcomes, not only in the affected hospital, but also across the broader region, and sometimes even the entire country, as we've seen in the Change Healthcare attack. And with that, I hand over to Tom to talk a little bit about the general software industry and how it relates to the healthcare industry.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Axel. I want to emphasize that, if the background noise, I can hear a little now, but if it ever becomes too loud, put something in the Q&A. I'm watching the Q&A now. Let me know that. I mean, I might have to, just stop speaking for a little while, much though it's hard for me to do that. So, okay, so my topic is vulnerability management in particular. and it's useful to contrast medical device makers with software developers when you're talking about vulnerability management. So a software developer needs to inform their customers about vulnerabilities found in the products they utilize, as well as provide patches for serious vulnerabilities. I mean, that's pretty much what they have to do. Now, a software developer does this, or should do it, by first reporting vulnerabilities to CVE.org. And that is the database. It's operated by MITRE Corporation. It's run, well, it's owned by Department of Homeland Security. They used to be called MITRE, the database, but now it's called CVE.org. It's now run by a nonprofit board called CVE.org. And so the first is you report a vulnerability to CVE.org, and then the developer makes a patch available to customers as soon as possible after serious vulnerability is identified. I want to emphasize that most vulnerabilities, the great majority of them, maybe like probably over 95%, are reported by the developer itself. It's not that someone blew the whistle and say, hey, you have this vulnerability. It's they discover the vulnerability, or sometimes they're told about it, but they report it. And they do that because they want to help their customers. So, okay, next slide, please. So now how should MDMs, medical device makers, report vulnerabilities? Now, MDMs have constraints that most software developers don't have, and that's why I treat them differently. Now, these include that they can't issue patches as quickly as software developers, since you developing and validating a patch for a device is much harder than it is for a standalone software product. And another is that a hospital, which is an HDO, healthcare delivery organization, can't simply apply the patch the moment they receive it. In fact, it may take months for them to do that because, the machines are being used all the time, infusion pumps and things like that. And they can't just unplug somebody and say, well, we got a patch, we'll start giving you your medicine again another hour. So they put things off for months, and therefore you don't want to announce a vulnerability right away, because most of your hospitals won't have applied the patch. So that's a concern. But then if an MDM only provides patches as part of a full device update, that's a problem. Because most MDMs, as far as I know, don't do a full device update very regularly. Often it's just annually, and sometimes even less often than that. But that you can't leave your customers unprotected. You can't not report a vulnerability for 2 years. Sure, maybe you're not going to patch it as part of the a regular update, maybe, and it's going to be 2 years before the next one. But you can't leave your customers without that knowledge. At the very least, they can pull your device off their network. That's one way of mitigating the vulnerability. And if it's a serious vulnerability and it's going to be in there for 2 years, I would say the customer really ought to do that. Now, MDMs do special things when important vulnerabilities are out there, like the log4shell vulnerability, but that's a consideration. So, for example, if the hospital knows about a serious vulnerability in their device, they don't have to wait for the MDM to issue a patch. They can just remove the device from their network. But if the MDM doesn't report the vulnerability, the hospital doesn't know about it. So the FDA suggests cybersecurity routine updates and patches to remediate vulnerabilities. And these are ones that are not rushed. They have a schedule, but I think the schedule should be something less than a year. But they should, the idea is you don't have to rush them out. If there's controlled risk of patient harm, but if there's uncontrolled risk, then they're just unacceptable risks, then they should be remediated as quickly as possible. Okay, next slide, please. And where should the MDMs report vulnerabilities? Software developers mostly report them to cve.org. This makes them searchable in the National Vulnerability Database, although having said that, the National Vulnerability Database is having huge problems now. So that's a whole different story. Unfortunately, we don't have time to discuss it now. But they will be searchable in any database that uses CVEs, and the vast majority of vulnerability databases are based on CVEs. There's some other ones like GitHub security advisories and things, but they're fairly small, and sometimes they have a CVE anyway. So software developers really need to report them to cve.org. Now, device makers sometimes, like Cisco, report their vulnerabilities in their devices. Now, they don't make medical devices, as far as I know, but they report, they make lots of networking devices and things, and they report all those to cve.org. However, the medical device makers may choose different or multiple routes. They could go to cve.org. They could go to ICS CERT, which is, of course, operated by CISA, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security. And that, as far as I know, is kind of the preferred route for medical device makers. Or they can report them directly to customers. I mean, it wouldn't hurt to do all three. In fact, most software developers, report directly to customers as well as reporting to cve.org. I do have a problem if the medical device maker only reports to their customers and nowhere else, because then nobody else other than their customers can learn about vulnerabilities. And if someone's trying to compare devices, for their security posture, they can't do that. So that's the problem there. But so I think they should be reported either to cve.org or ICS CERT, or perhaps both. Okay, and I think that's pretty much what we have. Or through, okay, and that's a good point, that it can also be reported to the ISAO itself. In fact, that should be done regardless of what we say. Okay. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. You know what, I forgot. So, well, okay, is it enough to report to ICS CERT? In many cases, I think it would be, because people can look in there. If they're looking for medical devices, they can look in there and they'll find, vulnerabilities in different types of infusion. So it is a publicly searchable database, and that's the main thing that you need. But then this other note is that there may be additional reporting requirements in case of serious adverse events, not just that you have a vulnerability, but that someone has exploited it and, and perhaps caused damage. So you need to, there's more reporting that has to be done in that event. Okay, well, thank you then, and I'll turn it over to Om now.
Yeah, so one of the underlying questions is, what vulnerabilities should a device manufacturer actually report? In most ideal case, in a hospital or a clinic should be able to easily learn what vulnerabilities are actually on their device. Things like operating system vulnerabilities should be easy for a hospital to know, because they're, the operating system version and stuff like that is relatively easy to pick up. But it really comes down to ownership of the device, right? If the device manufacturer is owning the actual device that a hospital is using, if they're providing updates that include updates to the operating system, it's also under the purview of the device manufacturer to actually provide updates, right, to the hospital and also alert them about any critical vulnerabilities. Otherwise, hospitals kind of get, put in a challenging position where there might be some OS level vulnerability that's really high risk that they know can cause issues, and they might need to take that device offline, like Tom was talking about earlier, or even worse, maybe shut down a specific lab because that device is not operable. Additionally, device manufacturers, in addition to the operating system level vulnerabilities, need to also be reporting vulnerabilities to their own software. Right? The applications they're writing or any firmware they're writing, there's vulnerabilities in there that impact the security of the overall device and impact the functionality of it and increase more risk. They should be reporting vulnerabilities against the device, like I said, using an identifier for the device, but underneath that, those vulnerabilities could be for the own first or second party software they're writing, or the actual operating system. A good analogy I kind of think about is if you get iPhone or Android updates, you'll get security updates in addition to the operating system updates. And those security updates aren't, it depends how much detail there is, but sometimes they won't go into detail if it's a specific application or service on the phone, or that's being impacted, or it's a kernel that's being impacted. It's kind of a more holistic. The device is getting updated with security patches throughout that stack. And so it's important when we're thinking about how your device manufacturer in the medical space needs to also report vulnerabilities. I think it's useful to use that analogy and kind of follow a similar paradigm where a device manufacturer is reporting vulnerabilities for the whole device and the release version, because that's what the end user, the hospital or clinic, knows, and is servicing vulnerabilities and patches for everything from application software they're written to the operating system and firmware, as long as they kind of are shipping that device to a hospital. So kind of going back to how device manufacturers currently seem to be publicly talking about vulnerability disclosure and where it's being reported. CISA maintains something called ICS CERT, where if you can look up security advisories for medical devices under the medical device category. And you can see over the past few years, the device manufacturers who've reported security advisories. And these security advisories, seem to only include publicly disclosed information. They're not, they don't, and which doesn't mean hospitals or the end users, right, of these devices have been alerted about these vulnerabilities. So over the next one or two slides, we're going to go over some examples of what those advisories look like and some key takeaways. So there's a recent medical device vulnerability. If just kind of looking at the National Vulnerability Database for security issues, right, in healthcare, against a workstation that used to be an independent company called Merge Healthcare that got bought by IBM a few years ago. There's a vulnerability recently in 2024 found by a third party, reported to the NVD. IBM might even have a page about this vulnerability, but there's no ICS cert for this actual security issue impacting this medical device, which leads to, right, how would a hospital or an end user of this workstation find out about this vulnerability? They would either happen to be monitoring IBM's communications about disclosing the vulnerability, or themselves going to the NVD and like searching and trying to find this on their own. And that can be really difficult for especially the smaller, less resourced hospitals and clinics who don't have dedicated staff, right, doing this on a regular basis. And then if you think about the tens, if not hundreds of medical devices a hospital or clinic own, it's not really a scalable solution. And so the lack of this data being reported to ICS CERT in addition to the MDSAO/CV.org is leading to also some uncertainty about, right, what is someone supposed to be monitoring from a hospital's perspective. if you look at now, kind of turning the table, if we look at all the ICS certs that are medical advisories, the majority of them do, have a lot more information. They contain a high level summary, some risk evaluation, some technical details, and these technical details are usually contain effective products, the CVEs, so the vulnerabilities actually assigned to this advisory. Oftentimes, it's not always a one-to-one relationship. There can be many vulnerabilities against one advisory, but it's not. There's some, still some differences in the data that's in the advisory versus what might end up in a vulnerability database like the MED. It's not always guaranteed that they're linking to a CVE or a vulnerability. The content might not be exactly the same, as well as the severity score, right, could also be different. And additional information, like for example, the mitigation here provided by this Medtronic medical advisory talks about an update will be provided in the future that will address vulnerabilities that were disclosed in this advisory. It's great that there will be an update provided, but this one's from early 2023. There's no updated information in over a year about what that update actually is for a hospital to apply or run on their device. So while it's good that device manufacturers are submitting data into ICS cert, there still seems to be some missing information about, as a hospital, as an end user, what are you actually supposed to do with the information provided here? Likely it would require you to pick up the phone, call Medtronic or your service rep, right? And that becomes a more manual and time-consuming process. So what role do SBOMs play in vulnerability management? So one of the key things, SBOMs, kind of came into play a few years ago. And one of the biggest pillars of SBOMs is really improving transparency and trust between vendors and buyers, right? This is right. SBOMs aren't just a concept in the medtech space, right? There's something in the general software and IT industry, and that have become more and more popular through regulatory bodies like the FDA, but also the executive branch pushing for SBOM adoption in government contracts. In general, an SBOM is really a list of ingredients, right, to how a software application is built, to how a device is built, right? Like what are underlying supply chain things that are being used to actually make that application or that device. And one of the key aspects is, well, by monitoring those supply chain software projects, you can also improve the security of your device. And by doing that on a regular basis, in a Cisco case study, Cisco's been a huge adopter publicly of SBOMs and have been pushing it for a few years now. And they themselves are a really good example to follow, and how a large organization is being very efficient in their implementation of SBOM adoption. From being able to request SBOMs from Cisco, right, as a buyer via the portal, which makes it accessible, right? If you need that SBOM, you can directly ask for it and request it through a very clear process, instead of having to ask around and can get caught up in legal or process complications. Additionally, they themselves are adopting internally, where they're using SBOMs to improve the security of their software and devices. They include it in their DevSecOps processes. So as part of a CI/CD build, they're doing things like SBOM generation, monitoring those releases for vulnerabilities, and utilizing that information to make sure they're patching and when they're providing updates to their devices, or remediating as many of those vulnerabilities as possible. In addition to that, they're also publicly disclosing vulnerability data when it's appropriate, and making those updates available via the portal. So they're making sure they're updating publicly accessible things like the MED, cv.org, and also ICS cert and CISA's Kev list, while also making sure there's a pathway for their customers to get this information. And that's a really good strategy of, one of the key things is we wouldn't want a hospital or clinic needing to monitor 10 different feeds, right, to really understand what they're vulnerable to, what they need to patch. And taking an approach where you're both publicly making data accessible and easily findable, while also making a very clear path to actually get access to the patches or any other information, are really important paths for, say, device manufacturer to take. So thinking, kind of going back into medtech and medical device manufacturers' perspective on what are actually use cases of SBOMs. Earlier I mentioned in the Cisco case study, Cisco does a good job of including in their DevSecOps. So it's doing things like generating SBOMs as part of your continuous integration and continuous deployment builds pipelines, allows you to stay on top of any updates the software R&D team might have made to any external dependencies being used, make sure those are still secure versions being used. Vulnerabilities come out left and right. There's always a graph, and there's always a ongoing conversation about the number of vulnerabilities have only increased year on year, and it's only getting worse. And so the packages that might be secure today, in a month from now, or even tomorrow, will likely have new vulnerabilities against them, might have exploits against them, and then so it's really, really important to make sure you're on a regular basis, on a continuous basis, you're making sure you're generating SBOMs for new versions of software you're developing or devices you're developing, using that to catch any outdated or high-risk dependencies earlier in the development process and upgrading them, because one of the biggest things is by doing that work today, while it can be additional work in the pre-market side of things, will lower operating costs once you go into post-market. The 5 or 100 vulnerabilities that you didn't patch today will grow into 2x or 3x in a year or two when you do go to market. So it's really important to try to do as much of the heavy lifting in pre-market, put really good, strong processes in place to make sure your operating risk down the line gets your operating costs go down. Additionally, SBOMs, one of the other data fields that are usually monitored are things like licenses and level of support. It's things that FDA asks for, and it's really important to understand, right, if you're shipping a medical device or software as a medical device, what are the, if you're using any third-party dependencies, what are the licenses, and make sure you have a good, clear visibility into what licenses are actually being used to make sure you're not violating anything, and also what level of support those dependencies have. Cool. I'll hand it off to Axel to talk more about the post-market use cases.
Right. Thanks, Om. So I think the pre and post-market use case for SBOM is distinctly different. In the pre-market case, as Om was saying, it is all about creating a more secure product, including non-security aspects like licensing and end of life and so forth. In the post-market use case, it's really more about being able to identify new vulnerabilities, being able to respond to newly identified vulnerabilities, and being able to efficiently assess the risk, whether it's controlled or uncontrolled, and to also effectively communicate with your customers. Right. So in fact, the FDA is now requiring that in your pre-market submission for market clearance, that you need to include a plan to monitor, identify, and address as appropriate in a reasonable time post-market cybersecurity vulnerabilities and exploits. Right. And SBOM is not the only tool, but it is certainly one of the key tools here. And that plan should include things like the personnel responsible, the sources and methods you're using to identify vulnerabilities, and those could be databases like NVD, ICS-CERT, CISA-KEF, the Known Exploited Vulnerability Database, but also information you receive through MDMs, through your supply chain, through periodic security testing, as well as then partners, researchers, coordinated vulnerability disclosure, and so forth. You also should define what your process is to develop and release patches and how you intend to communicate the availability of patches to your customers. and then also discuss the actual secure update process, right? That is where the rubber hits the road, meaning it is not just about getting a patch posted on your website or your service portal, but how does the patch actually get then onto the device, and what are your metrics? As in how quickly can you release a patch, and how quickly then, and how easy it is to deploy the patch onto your fielded devices. There's also in the IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, in their document, they have interesting discussion contrasting pre and post market. And I'm just going to summarize that in the graph here up top. Basically, in the pre-market, the purpose is to design for security. Right? You should minimize post-market risk, and you should minimize post-market reactive needs. You should not look at your post-market processes to address things you didn't have time to address in pre-market. Contrary, in post-market, you should, again, not address things you missed, but you should respond to changing risks. Now, that's the ideal state. We're not quite there yet, obviously, but again, I think that's what we all should be striving for, because obviously addressing vulnerabilities pre-market is much more cost-effective and much quicker, and has much less impact on your installed base and your customers than addressing it post-market. So if you look at the general life cycle in pre-market, from concept planning over design, development, integration, and then your testing and documentation, and then you have that magic point that is called market release, that may come with regulatory hiccups or not, but eventually you get your product out there, and then in the post-market you still need to manage your supply chain, perform your post-market surveillance, manage vulnerabilities, and communicate and mitigate. So in the pre-market, in order to get things under control, you want a threat model, and you want to do that early. But threat modeling is a methodology to assess your architecture and your design. Predominantly, there are other uses for threat modeling as well. But before you write code, you want to use threat modeling to make sure that your architecture is actually solid from a security perspective. And then, of course, you want to deploy risk management principles. You want to make sure that you have a device that is secure by design and secure by default, right? Meaning it should be deployed in the most secure possible state, and that then down configuration of security should be a decision the customer makes, but is not preempted by the manufacturer. And then, of course, everything needs to be documented. You need to demonstrate that indeed you did what you said you're going to do. In the transition from pre to post market, you need to be able to demonstrate that you designed the product with post market in mind. And that includes a number of things, including your ability to perform a secure engineering transfer into production. But you want to make sure that your product software, including updates and patches, can be transferred and released without there being a risk of them being compromised. And unfortunately, there are some horror stories out there of hospitals that have actually received devices that already had malware on them that came with pre-installed viruses, and that can be due to either shortcomings in the engineering transfer process or shortcomings in the production process that was not properly secured and something snuck in. And then, of course, you want to make sure that your device is updatable as easy and quickly as possible, and that your device is capable of detecting and logging security events. So again, design in the pre-market with post-market in mind. And then in the post-market, you want to monitor cybersecurity signals. You want to be able to identify vulnerabilities and risks. You want to be able to deploy timely mitigations, have documentation available that is updated and maintained as part of that process. And the SBOM is not the only thing, but it is one of the cornerstones of your post-market activities. And then, of course, you want to have and establish measures and metrics that allow you to justify your processes, but also to analyze and learn from things that need to be improved, and also important that you can communicate then up the chain in your company so that your executive management and your boards are aware of the quality of your post-market processes and potential gaps that need to be addressed either through investment in tools and technologies or through improvements of processes and other examples. Now, this is highly simplified, and reality is much more complicated, but for the sake of this presentation, right? So every medical device manufacturer has a supply chain that comprises of contracted software that is developed under contract, commercial software, databases, operating systems, whatnot, embedded software that comes with your hardware, video drivers, your Bluetooth stack, and so forth. And then, of course, any open source software you may be using. And of course, your level of control over that particular software component decreases as you go down the stack, right? You have very high control over whatever you contract because you can write your security terms into the contract, and then it decreases from there. But in the end, all goes into the medical device, gets compared with the application software you're writing yourself, which then makes up that finished medical device and its supporting documentation, including SBOM. And ideally, then when your customers receive the medical device, they should also then receive the SBOM and other security information that then becomes part of their database, whether it is a CMMS, computerized maintenance management system, or other inventory or security management systems, that the various types of systems out there. I just picked CMMS as an example here. But obviously for the HDO, things are much more complicated because you are not their only supplier, right? They have many other medical devices they buy from many other medical device manufacturers. So the volume of SBOMs they collect and need to analyze increases rapidly and is significant, and that is one of the challenges. So if we talk about the challenges, right, obviously for the device manufacturer, your challenge is your supply chain, to monitor it, to maintain visibility over vulnerability, and to demonstrate compliance, but also to assure interoperability of the individual components and make sure that your interoperability doesn't introduce vulnerabilities and exploitabilities. On the other side, the healthcare organization, their challenge is asset inventory, the quality of your asset inventory. When you get an advisory from a supplier of yours or from the FDA or anybody else, are you able to identify correctly those devices and the correct version of the device? And many healthcare organizations are challenged there today. And one of the challenges is the diversity of the devices on hospital networks. There are many other industries that share some of healthcare's problems. For example, if you look at the energy sector, they have as many legacy devices with outdated operating systems as we have. They have the same maintenance cycle challenges we have in the healthcare industry, that they may only be able to apply patches, for example, on an annual basis rather than immediately. But the diversity of equipment from many different manufacturers and devices of many different security maturities, that I think is unique to the healthcare industry, and that is a unique challenge we face. And then, of course, it's the data quality, right? How good is your asset inventory? How good are your SBOMs? How well are you able to interpret your SBOM to identify the right vulnerabilities? Do you have the right tools? Can you identify the devices? And then can you manage change, right? Are there dependencies? Are there clinical operations? And many times deploying patches in healthcare organizations can take a long time because of ongoing care delivery operations, but certainly also about questions around device ownership and responsibilities. But is it a radiology device or is it a piece of lab equipment? Maybe entirely different responsibilities. Is the service contract for the device contracted out to an ISO or the manufacturer, which is an entirely different picture at that point. And then, of course, there are shared challenges around data sources, especially naming conventions and data quality. There are many problems with our ability to identify the right software components in an SBOM, name it correctly, and make sure that we can find it on our devices, because the naming conventions unfortunately leave room for flexibility and ambiguity. One of the other purposes of SBOM, other than vulnerability management, is also end of life and end of support management. But this particular graph is from an HSCC white paper going by the lovely name of HICMALS, which is the Health Industry Cybersecurity Managing Legacy Technology Security white paper, which discusses legacy devices both from the manufacturer as well as from the operator, meaning the hospital perspective. And it defines very much the applicable terms that end of life happens at the end of production and sale. Then there's a phase of guaranteed support, and then there's usually a phase of limited support, which then leads to the final end of support. And during that time, that final dark red period here, typically risk and license transfer should happen, right? What does the healthcare organization need to know in order to continue to operate the device? Or do they need to know that they better should decommission it? Do they need to take on certain licenses and start to pay the license fees, and so forth? And that, of course, involves training, it involves transfer of warranty, and so forth. Now, there are a number of challenges here. There are many times regional, like in the US, the FDA, regulators that regulate at least the market introduction and may get involved even into end of life announcement. The decommissioning from the hospital, right, is different than an end of life. It is more of an end of use. So if I look at the end of life of the manufacturer, that typically affects an entire device line of products, device type or device version. Whereas from the hospital perspective, right, I may replace 2 of my infusion pumps because they dropped on the floor 1 too many times and have a cracked case, but the other 900 I keep operating. Right? So really, from the hospital perspective, it is not so much an end of life, it is more an end of use, which then includes also decommissioning and data sanitization and other activities. There's an interesting statement by the FDA. I summarized it. It's a little more complex across half a page, but what they're basically saying that the transfer of risk to the operator from a cybersecurity perspective can only happen if the risk is actually transferable. So it is not a here you go catch it exercise. It should be a well thought through and well planned exercise, so that again, the hospital is able and willing and capable to take on the risk of maintaining the legacy device, and also fully understands what the risk is if they keep the device in operation. Last point here, unfortunately, with cybersecurity becoming one of the main considerations here, we also got an issue that actually the software end of life and end of support may happen at a different time than the physical devices end of life and end of support, right? So I may still be able to buy spare parts, but I may not be able to update the software. So what can an MDM do? Obviously, you want to implement a secure development lifecycle process, including communication. This is from an HISAC white paper that discusses your pre-market activities at the upper left circle, the inclusion of the supply chain, that is the upper right circle, then communication and sale to the healthcare organization, that's the lower left, and then communication of security documentation, including then updates and mitigations, that is the lower right circle. And again, this is all discussed in great detail in this white paper. But the point being is that a secure development lifecycle is not only limited to what happens inside the manufacturer, it also includes the manufacturer's supply chain, the manufacturer's customers, and tying it all together as part of the post-market management process. There's also recently released an HSCC white paper, the Joint Security Plan version 2, or sometimes short referred to as JSP2, that talks big picture, but tying it together nicely across the entire development cycle, including then here in red, the post-market activities, including surveillance and maintenance and incident response and so forth. So it's a great white paper to get your feet wet. It doesn't give you all the detail you need, but it certainly ties it all together very effectively and allows you to establish your own plans as a manufacturer. Then security documentation. There's the manufacturer disclosure statement of medical device security, short MDS2, which is a way to communicate device security properties and configurations and deployment considerations and so forth as part of the procurement process. Right? So it can be part of the contracting in procurement. Then there should be also considerations around certain contractual agreements that pertain to security. For example, IC 8001-2-6 talks about a responsibility agreement, which would then stipulate the responsibilities for certain security activities between the operator, typically the hospital, and the vendors and suppliers in a contractual way. And it addresses, again, why that agreement exists, who participates, how to communicate, who is responsible, what methods are applied, and how does it affect, and is used across the life cycle. Also, more and more, of course, medical devices connect to a cloud service, an additional service that the medical device manufacturer may provide, including cloud services related to maintenance and management, but also cloud services related to patient data management and analysis and whatnot. And if patient data is involved, then under HIPAA, the medical device manufacturer becomes a business associate, and therefore a business associate agreement under HIPAA would be applicable and would need to be enforced, including things like breach notification. There is also then another HSCC document, the model contract language for MedTech cybersecurity, the MC2, that talks about 14 core principles that define various aspects around performance maturity and design, product design maturity between the MDM and the operator, and how that can be contractually articulated. So as a hospital, you can look into this document and literally lift contract clauses pertaining to cybersecurity into your procurement contracts. Now, this document is currently being updated. In fact, we are finishing it up as we speak, and there will be a version 2 coming out, at least for public review and comment shortly, and then a final version, hopefully not too long after. So wrapping it up and concluding, SBOMs are now a requirement. FDA and many other international regulators ask for it as part of the market approval process. Certainly, if you sell to the US government, DoD or VA hospitals, you will need to supply the SBOM to that particular customer, meaning the US government. And it increasingly becomes in the non-government markets part of purchasing contract. The expected outcomes in the pre-market space, it's obviously you want to design more secure products and be able to demonstrate that you indeed designed a more secure product. And then in the post-market, better management of security posture of devices in the field, and demonstration that you can handle post-market risks. However, challenges remain, and it is still hard work, right? The SBOM is a tool, and as the saying goes, a good drill doesn't make a good dentist, and the same is true for SBOM. Even a good SBOM still requires a lot of activities around it, and we need to deal and manage inconsistency, for example, in software component naming. We need to understand, as Tom talked about extensively, the uniqueness of the medical device use case, and there are some challenges there. The MDMs are challenges generating quality SBOMs, and make productive use of SBOM within their risk management processes, both pre and post market. And then the healthcare delivery organizations are challenged in ingesting SBOMs and make them part of their inventory management and be able to manage the right version of the SBOM to the right version of the physical device, and then meaningfully interpret the SBOM data. And all of this requires tools, right? The amount of data is just way too complex for humans to handle. It is more than just an SBOM data problem. It includes things like compliance, processes, communication, and again, inventory matching, and so forth. And with that, we're moving on to Q&A, and I'm gonna actually stop the screen sharing here so I can look at the questions. But one point I want to make here finally, and that is that of the attendees today, we will draw 5 names of people that qualify for a free rapid cybersecurity maturity assessment. Of course, those 5 wouldn't need to be medical device manufacturers, otherwise that exercise wouldn't make sense. So if you're one of the winners, you may receive an email from us where we offer you that free rapid assessment, which includes an analysis of a sample SBOM you can provide to us. So thanks everybody, and with that, I'll stop the sharing and start looking at questions.
Yeah, there's a question from Ron asking, there are multiple SBOM specification standards. Do you see one emerging as a de facto standard?
Tom, do you want to take a first stab on that?
Yeah, no, I don't. There are 2 main SBOM formats right now, SPDX and CycloneDX. They're both international standards. In fact, CycloneDX just became an ECMA standard, ECMA, which is the European Computer Manufacturers Association. Today, I just saw the notice, and well, SPDX, a previous version anyway, was an ISO standard. So they're there. They both do things that are, they are very different packages. They both do certain things well, and others perhaps not so well. But there's such diversity. It doesn't do you any good to have just one, because you're going to lose so much of that diversity. I mean, it's just like saying, well, everyone has to buy a Ford. That's the only card we're going to let people buy. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So, you can use both, and they're interchangeable fairly well. You can translate back and forth. So, that's the way the free market is supposed to work.
Yeah, both SPDX and CycloneDX have become kind of the de facto SBOM standards. They're from 2 different organizations. There's widespread use of both. You tend to see a little bit more CycloneDX use in like the open source community, in things like application development. It's a bit more popular in things like the operating system, Linux, Windows. Those tend to have a bit more backing of SPDX being used. But like Tom said, both are good standards. They both have pros and cons. It really matters like what tech stack or what you're trying to do. It kind of depends on that. We've seen organizations use both, right? Because they'll have a Linux device and they'll have an SPDX SBOM for that. They'll have a .NET application and they'll have a CycloneDX SBOM for that. Additionally, regulatory bodies seem to be accepting both as okay SBOMs. Because the ask is really, right, use an industry standard SBOM in a machine mutable format, and both CycloneDX and SPDX meet those requirements.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any further questions in the Q&A. If anybody has any, it would be great. Okay, so there's one here. Could you speak to some cybersecurity best practices for AI development? Training, validation, testing typically occurs very early on the development lifecycle, sometimes before software planning has occurred. Most cybersecurity guidance applies specifically integrated software. Yeah, fair point. I think there are a couple of documents to point you to. FDA, for example, has provided some guidance on AI development. There is a working group under AMI, the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, that currently is working on a technical paper on AI, including security. And there are also a number of documents out of the EU in support of their recently released AI Act. Okay. If there are no other questions, we'll call it a wrap. Some people stated that the audio was poor. It was okay for me, both for Tom and Om. But we'll look into that, and in either case, the slides will be available and the recording will be available. And there is a new question. How can SBOMs be leveraged for finding vulnerabilities in dependencies during a DevSecOps process? Are there any standards today? Tom, any thoughts on that?
No, I'm afraid I'll leave that to you.
Well, I
or
mean,
to Om seems to be maybe.
So yeah, I think he had to drop at 1 o'clock, so he just left. The point is that SBOM gives you the ability to identify the individual software components, and then your SBOM tool should provide you with the capability then to do matching across various vulnerability databases, NVD being the public one, that then allows you to identify and match vulnerabilities to software components. Of course, there are some issues there, including naming ambiguity that sometimes occurs, that different people that enter data into NVD name the same software components slightly different, and that difference may be as simple as a hyphen or a space. So a good software tool would recognize that and would therefore minimize both the false positives, which would lead to unnecessary engineering cycles, but also false negatives, which would be leading to obviously missed vulnerabilities. So, but if you want to discuss it in more detail, just shoot us an email.
Actually, I would like to add that, right now for identifying vulnerabilities, the NVD has kind of given up the ship. I mean, they are literally, they've fallen way behind what they had. They are supposed to be, they have a backlog of CVEs that need to be quote unquote enriched, which is now, will take them, it's growing, the backlog is growing, but even the current backlog is going to take more than a year to process. So they have a big problem. And unfortunately, the problem with the NVD now is you look in there and you look for vulnerabilities for a particular device, and it won't tell you, in almost every case, it won't tell you any vulnerabilities that were not in existence already by February this year. So you have to be very careful about using the NVD. It can't be used as, oh, well, things are great, I don't see any vulnerabilities here. It's probably just the opposite. So you have to be very careful about that. There are alternatives. I mean, there's CVE.org is free. In fact, most vulnerability databases are free. And unfortunately, it's kind of going to have to be a, buyer beware process, but don't just assume the NVD is giving you good information anymore, because it's not.
But these not current information. That's correct. Yeah, they do have.
Well, it's not current. Well, but the thing is, people want the current information. You're not there to look up vulnerabilities that occurred last year. I mean, you presumably already know about those. It's the ones that you have occurred recently, and right now they are just so far behind, and it's going to be very hard for them to catch up, to be honest, ever. I mean, it's a big problem. It's not just a a small irritation.
Yeah, certainly true.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, but there are alternatives, cv.org, for example. There are commercial alternatives.
Yeah,
So there are a couple of sources out there. Yeah. Okay. We're 5 minutes past, so why don't we wrap now? I don't see any more questions. Thank you, folks, for joining, and again, recording and the handouts will be available, and you may get an email from us if you win one of the free rapid cybersecurity maturity assessments. Thank you, and thanks, Tom, for supporting this.
You're welcome.